Thank you everyone for making the time to attend this press conference. I call this press conference to ask the government whether it is correct to make the 2017 presidential election a reserve election. I think it should be an open election. For those new to Singapore politics, our constitution was recently changed. We now have a new article, 19B(1). This article reserves an election for a racial group if no one from that community has been president for the 5 most recent presidential terms. Now, the purpose for a reserve election was explained in the Constitutional Commission's report dated 17 August 2016. They said that a reserve election for a minority group should only be invoked if voters do not choose someone from that minority group as president of the 5 consecutive presidential terms produced by free and unregulated elections. Let's look at what the Constitutional Commission's report originally said. And I quote, "If free and unregulated elections produce presidents from a varied distribution of ethnicities, the requirement of a reserve election will never be triggered. This may be illustrated in the following scenario. An election is reserved for racial group A because no candidate from racial group A has been elected for 5 consecutive terms," unquote. The free and unregulated elections mentioned by the Commission is what many people call open elections. It is not closed to a specific group of candidates. It is a presidential election where candidates of all races can stand and voters can elect a president who is Chinese, Malay, Indian, or any other race. The government said the Attorney General's chambers advised the Prime Minister that 2017 will be our first reserve election. This is based on AGC's counting 5 consecutive presidential terms beginning from President Wee Kim Wee. Now, I question whether AGC's method of counting is actually in line with the spirit and purpose put forward by the Constitutional Commission for having a reserve election. The AGC included a nominated president in their count, but the Commission's emphasis was on open elections where voters failed to vote in a minority president. Let me read for you what the Commission said again. And I quote, "If free and unregulated election produce presidents from a varied distribution of ethnicities, the requirement of a reserve election will never be triggered. This may be illustrated in the following scenario. An election is reserved for racial group A because no candidate from racial group A has been elected for 5 consecutive terms," unquote. The government white paper published on 15 September 2016 accepted the position. At paragraph 81 and 82, they explain a reserve election will never arise if free and unregulated elections produce presidents of varied ethnicities. It will only be invoked if there has not been a president of a given ethnicity for an exceedingly long period. And the government agrees with the approach proposed by the Commission, unquote. Now, that is government's position. Now, on November 7, 2016, in Parliament, the DPM Teo Chee Hean, at a second reading of the Constitution Amendment Bill, repeated that the reserve election will only come into play if open elections fail to return the president from the different races. And I quote paragraph 107B of his speech. It will only come into play if open elections fail to periodically return presidents from the different races. So open elections is the trigger for reserve elections. Now, DPM Teo then introduced the new Article 19B of our Constitution, paragraph 109 of his speech, by saying, and I quote, elections will generally be open to candidates from all races. However, if a particular racial group has not held the presidency for the most recent 5 consecutive terms, Article 19B1 reserves the next election for that group. Now, reading DPM's statement, which adopted the Commission's report and the white paper, it is obvious that 5 open elections must first take place before there is a reserve election. So his reference to the most recent 5 consecutive terms to be counted must therefore mean the most recent 5 consecutive terms produced by open elections. However, one day later, on 8th November 2016, PM Lee, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, told Parliament that AGC had advised the government to count 5 consecutive terms of presidents who exercised elected powers. I emphasize, who exercised elected powers. So AGC counted Dr. Wee Kim Wee, 5 presidents from Dr. Wee Kim Wee, 5 presidents with elected powers. And this is what the Prime Minister said. We have taken the Attorney General's advice. We will start counting from the first president who exercised the powers of the elected president. That means we are now in the 5th term of the elected presidency, unquote. Now, the counting is clearly different from what the Commission said previously. If you recall, the Commission said, and I repeat, I quote again, an election is reserved for racial group A because no candidate from racial group A has been elected for 5 consecutive terms. The Commission's emphasis was on open elections and not presidents who exercise elected powers. So AGC's trigger and the Commission's trigger for the reserve elections is different. Unfortunately, there was no debate on whether AGC advised the government correctly. The government also declined the opportunity to explain this in Parliament. As a result of AGC's advice, 2017 became a reserve election, a reserve election year. So we need to know why the AGC not ever advised the Prime Minister to count 5 open elections in line with the spirit and purpose of the Commission. And why did the AGC also advise the Prime Minister, that Singapore is now in the 5th term of the elected presidency when only 4 presidents have been returned by open elections. In all my 26 years in Parliament, we had always referred to Mr. Ong Teng Cheong as the first elected president. Our presidents, past and present, and ministers and MPs in Parliament have all referred to President Ong Teng Cheong directly or indirectly as Singapore's first elected president and the first elected presidency. Even the Constitutional Commission's report contains a statement calling President Ong Teng Cheong the first elected president. That is also the view of most, if not all, Singaporeans I've spoken to. I think I refer to the slide. They will give you an idea of the reference to Ong Teng Cheong as our first elected president. So the list is very long, and it refers not only to the Hansard, but also to the various media, and also even to Istana. Okay. So you can see, these are all the various, right? Now to summarize, I put forward the reasons why I think 2017 should be an open election year. I think my understanding is consistent with the Commissioner's spirit and purpose for introducing reserve elections. The AGC should have counted the 5 most recent presidential terms produced by open elections. This starts with President Ong Teng Cheong. I now invite the government or the AGC to explain why they counted the presidential terms of presidents who exercise elected powers. If need be, the government can refer AGC's opinion to court for independent judicial verification. After all, the courts have the final say on legal issues in Singapore. And the recent high-profile Court of Appeal case have shown that the AGC is not always correct in the legal position, in the legal opinion. Now, if the government double-checks the AGC's advice with the court, then Parliament and the people of Singapore can be satisfied beyond doubt that the constitutional changes they are making stand on strong legal foundations. But if the government simply accepts AGC's advice without explaining why they accepted the accuracy of the opinion, I am concerned that our elected presidency will always be tainted with the suspicion that the reserve elections of 2017 was introduced to prevent my candidacy. How we do things is as important as what we do. On this note, I would urge the government to explain or refer AGC's opinion to court to confirm whether AGC's advice is in sync with the Commission's spirit and purpose of having reserve elections. Thank you.